Thank you so much, Christina.
You're welcome. You're live now. Have a good meeting.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Vice Chair Sarah Copley, and I'd like to welcome you to the April 29th Homeless Initiative Advisory Committee meeting. The committee members and staff are participating virtually still. We appreciate your patience as we work through the committee meetings a little bit differently on these platforms. We are streaming live on the City of Asheville Virtual Engagement Hub, which is accessible through the Virtual Engagement Hub link on the front page of the City of Asheville website. I'm going to say that again. We are streaming live on the Virtual Engagement Hub, and that link is available on the front page of the City of Asheville website. It is also linked on the Homeless Initiative Advisory Committee page. We do have an option for public to listen live by phone, and for everyone attending today, thank you so much and welcome. I'm going to go through our roll call this morning. We do have quorum. Our current members today: David Bartholomew.
Present.
Thank you. Lance Crawford. Jason Desai.
Present.
Elvia Diaz. Debbie Alford for Amy Hobson.
Present.
Kim McEllier.
Here.
Thank you. David Nash. Angel Stout. Joelle Steininger. And Jennifer Teague.
Here.
Thank you all so much for attending today. So committee members, you've had a chance to review the consent agenda that you were sent in the meeting materials earlier this week. Do I have any questions, comments, or concerns? No. Okay, so we do need to take a vote, Emily, on accepting the consent agenda since we're not reviewing that publicly. So I'm just going to go quickly through with first names. If you can say yes or no to approving the consent agenda. David?
Yes.
Jason?
Yes.
Debbie?
Yes.
Tim?
Yes.
Jennifer?
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. We'll enter that into the record. And I'm going to turn it over to Emily for item 3 on our agenda, staff updates.
Thank you. Good morning, David Nash. Also, just want to be sure, Sarah, you saw that he had joined.
Oh, great. No, thank you so much.
Good morning, all of you. Glad to be here with you. I have just a few updates. The first is about the point in time count. We had hoped to be able to share those results out this week, hope to do a presentation with you all. Needed a little bit more time, so are not going to be able to do that today, but the plan is to share those out with the community and City Council at the May 10th meeting, and then happy to do a detailed follow-up at the May HIAC meeting. I think that's a, point in time count is a really good data set for us because it is our most comprehensive community data set, even though it does have some limitations. So we'll plan to do a deep dive into the 2022 point in time data at the May HIAC meeting. Secondly, I wanted to follow up on the restructuring discussion. I know that previously Brian had sent you all a proposal about restructuring HIAC in order to align more closely with continuum of care guidelines. That was prior to the sort of overall discussion at the city about boards and commissions and restructuring some of that. And I think we have a couple of options to explore. There's quite a bit for us to work through in that process. And so just wanted to give you all an update that we are going to pause on a restructuring for the moment until we can get a little more staff capacity. At the moment, we are an office of one. And so until we can get some more resources to work with, we are just going to pause on that restructure and continue as we have been with HIAC. One thing that will mean is that we had asked the clerk's office at both the city and the county to pause on refilling vacant seats on this committee until we were through that restructuring process. So we are going to unpause that. We're going to get back to refilling those seats so that we can get back to full capacity with HIAC as quickly as possible. And so we'll be working with both the city and county to do that. Sarah is going to talk a bit about the nominating work group so that we can reactivate those folks and get that process underway and get a full committee here. And then we will certainly look to address our structure in the future and, in the coming months. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and get back to full HIAC. And then last thing for me is just an update about the consultant. So as you know, we the city has been working with Buncombe County and with Dogwood Health Trust. We collectively issued an RFP in February for a consultant to help us address unsheltered homelessness in particular, and to do a real needs assessment and develop some strategies that we can implement that will be really actionable. Proposals for that were due March 18th. We received 11 proposals, and our selection committee has been staffed from the city, from the county, and from Dogwood. We reviewed those 11 proposals. We interviewed the top three, our top ranked firms. We interviewed 3 firms and have selected a firm to recommend. We are still in the selection process and in the contract negotiation phase. And so that has to stay confidential for the moment. So I'm not able to share any additional details about that, but our plan is to have that announcement in the next couple of weeks. We will be at the May 10th City Council meeting asking Council to vote to accept funding from Dogwood Health Trust for the consultancy. So that contract will route through the City of Asheville, but be fully funded by Dogwood. So that will be on the Council agenda on May 10th. Past that point, we'll be able to finalize that contract, have a kickoff meeting with the consultant, and be able to really roll out what that process is going to look like and what the engagement opportunities for the community will be. I want to really encourage a lot of community participation in this. I'm really excited about this, the firm that we've selected. I am excited about the prospect and what this can mean for our community. I really hope that there will be a lot of HIAC engagement in this, but also just a lot of community engagement in this process. Because I think certainly we have a significant need related to unsheltered homelessness, but also unsheltered homelessness doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the context of our community's service system and all of the resources that we have available. So I think this will be really useful for us in addressing not only unsheltered homelessness, but homelessness across the board in our community. So excited to be able to share more details with you all as we go forward. And that's it for me. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Emily, do you have a timeline of from when the contract is initiated with the consultant, when their work product is expected?
We do have an anticipated timeline, but I'll be better able to answer that at the May meeting.
Okay. Great.
Jen?
Thanks, Emily, for those updates. I was thinking that the point in time count information was due to the next level, maybe by this date or sometime in the next few days. Can you speak to that? And then will that information be public prior to the May 10th meeting, or will it only become public at that May 10th meeting?
Yep. The HUD deadline, the federal deadline is today for submission. And so that data has been submitted to HUD. It wasn't complete in time to be able to put together a presentation and publish that in advance to follow our public meeting laws. And so we'll be working on rollout for those materials, but certainly at the May 10th meeting, we'll intend to share that with the community. So I would imagine a few days in advance, we'll have those data available.
Okay, great. And then I had one other question. It's my understanding there was a recent article, I guess, ABC 13 News about Ramada. Do you have any updates? Have you seen that article? Do you know anything in relationship to what's happening with that situation?
I have not seen that piece. So I can tell you about the real estate. Was it about the
It seems to be about a delay.
Okay. Yes, so that project is still on track. They are still under contract to purchase that to create permanent supportive housing. The closing date has been delayed related to the need to get an environmental assessment completed, which is, David actually may be able to speak to this. So So the environmental assessment is in process. We'll be waiting for HUD approval. That's related to the ability to access vouchers for those units in the future. And so again, still on track, but just waiting on that final approval of the environmental assessment. In the meantime, the hotel is continuing to operate as a hotel. And closing was, I'm sorry, I don't know the exact closing date, but I think it is anticipated to be June-ish, sometime in early summer. I don't know, David, if you have additional input on that.
I've got a lot of background noise, so it may not be a good day for me to talk much, but that's correct. There was some confusion about the scope of the environmental review that needed to be done for project-based vouchers. It's gotten cleared up now. It's being, that is a city responsibility. It's not something that the housing authority can do. So it's happening, I think, now. And I guess primarily it's a contractor to the developer that needs to gather the information, but the city needs to publish the environmental findings and make a final determination on that. We had hoped it would be a categorical exclusion, which means no environmental review. But I think the project is moving forward. We submitted a package of materials to last week, preliminary review of it. They do what's called a subsidy layering review. And that's kind of the key federal regulatory thing that has to happen for us to give them project-based vouchers. So, in other words, it's getting bigger, so I'll show you. Unless anybody has any questions.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks, David. Any other questions before we move on to our next agenda item? All right, thank you both so much. So today we have Debbie Alford, proxy for Amy Hobson. She's going to give us an update about Trinity Place. Thank you so much for coming today, Debbie. We really appreciate your time. So I'll turn the floor over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I apologize in advance if I keep turning my camera off. The internet at Trinity Place is sometimes a little spotty. We have, like many organizations, many nonprofits, many businesses over the last several years during the pandemic, really struggled with staffing. And we know that Trinity Place really works best with full-time staff that are able to commit long-term to, a regular schedule. And so that's what we have, always tried to strive for. And, over the last couple of years, we have lost and gained staff repeatedly and have really found that we have an awesome group of part-time folks that are not able to commit to a full-time schedule. So we've continued to struggle with that staffing model over the last few years. And so we have come to the very difficult and heartbreaking decision to close Trinity Place. Our last day of operation will be May 13th. And we are, working on serving out the last couple of clients that we have in the house, finding them, a safe place to be, and working with guardians, if that's DSS or parents or whatnot, to return them to their homes and, work with the community to figure out what's next for youth experiencing homelessness.
Oh, that's a lot. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I've been in Asheville for a long time and in various roles have referred a lot of kids and families to Trinity Place. So, my heart's definitely with you guys. How, I think two parts. I'm just going to jump in. If anybody wants to raise your hand, I'll try to do my best to pay attention. I do, the clients and the staff here are both of concern. So maybe, Debbie, can you tell us what some transition plans are for people who would normally refer to you? Where are those children going now?
Yeah, so we have a list of community resources that we are, able to pass out to folks that are calling us, because we still have our phone lines available, and so we're able to provide some counseling when folks are in need. We're trying to refer folks to other options in the area, whether it's youth respite homes or, for example, Alida has some great resources for youth. And so we're trying to put together that network for folks. Caring for Children is still in the community doing foster care and will remain doing that work, as well as our intensive in-home family case management program that we have. And so we're still very much involved in Western North Carolina and can serve families through those other programs as well. And so a lot of community members have asked, what can we do in this time? And I think our response is to consider becoming a foster parent. That is the real need in this community. And we need foster parents that are willing to work with teenagers. That's, the large population that we were serving at Trinity Place was teenagers that didn't, fit in anywhere else. And so we need foster families that are willing to do that work. As far as staff goes, we are working with them to find them other places to work. We've gotten several really awesome nonprofits that have reached out to us about any staff that may be looking for jobs. Again, a lot of our staff are part-time at this point. So it's just a few that we're trying to help find those permanent positions. And we've given the staff as much notice as we could so that it would help with that transition as well.
What are the plans for the shelter building?
We don't know at this point. We have graciously been able to operate for years and years because of the partnership with Trinity Episcopal. And so we're still in conversations with them about what this space is used for. And so we don't have an answer yet.
Thank you so much, Debbie.
Yeah.
I think it's really a huge consideration for our committee looking to the future. We have some financial decisions to make on this committee. We're looking to appoint new members, and certainly any startup projects, I can tell you from the grant making side, they're just not really able to be pulled off. So I think it's going to be an interesting year to see how we reconfigure. And I'm so sorry that one of the early victims of that, the staffing shortages, is Trinity Place for sure. So Debbie, if I can be of any help to you and your staff, or any of the committee can, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or Emily. It sounds like you have a plan in place, which sounds like you have a really active board. That's a really hard decision to make. And so I'm so sorry it had to be made, but just the concerns about safety with shelter, particularly with teens, it's very understandable wanting to have a safe and secure environment for them, particularly the population of kids that you're working with. Does anybody else have questions for Debbie? Okay, thank you so much, Debbie. Well, this is a way into our next agenda item. I do need a vote. Before we get to that, I'll give you a little description. So part of our restructuring also that we started at the beginning of this year, we do have 5 openings, and we've established some work groups, but before we need to do that, we need to dissolve our subcommittees formally with a vote. I did want to let this committee know that we have some really active members. I've already been contacted by people who have volunteered to be on the nominations committee that will be chaired by Jennifer T, made up of Jason Desai, myself, and Emily Ball. Thank you guys so much. We're going to be tackling that right away. I've sent the openings. So our bylaws state that we need to have representatives from certain aspects of the community, and you can see how important that is, right? Like just looking at the screen here and the different systems that we touch. So we really want to recruit to that. We also want to recruit with an equity model, and that's including the types of organizations and businesses that are represented. So we'll be looking for the nominations committee to really get started in the next month. We are also going to finalize our Code Purple committee. I have asked some unusual members, some committee members. There's a wonderful representative from the Asheville Police Department that's engaged with communities, but there's some protocols to having staff, city and county staff on work groups. So we're going to figure that out. That's to be decided probably next week. We'll also finalize the finance work group. So if anybody, again, wants to be on any committee that you heard, please contact myself or Emily. These are almost set. But if I can have a vote to formally dissolve our subcommittees, I'm going to just go through the roll call.
Sarah, before you do that, would you mind to just clarify which subcommittees we're actually dissolving? Or
Sure. The nominations subcommittee and the finance subcommittee. We did not have a Code Purple subcommittee that really took off, to my knowledge, Emily. Am I remembering that correctly? Yeah, okay. So it's those two. Thanks for clarifying.
At one time, we had a housing subcommittee too, a permanent housing subcommittee. Too.
I'm sorry, Dave, can you
Yes.
say that again? But the housing subcommittee, what was the next?
I think it was just called a housing subcommittee. It was a group of us looking at permanent housing options for people, new development of permanent housing options. We haven't met since COVID, but it was me, Scott Dedman, a couple other folks. Do we need to dissolve that one too, or?
We do, if that's been part of the structure. It wasn't in the bylaws, so I'm not sure if it was formerly a work group, but if you're remembering it as a subcommittee, we do. I would.
Subcommittee, it was a subcommittee. It was, may not have been in the bylaws, but it may have been just voted on.
Sure.
Yes,
And
I can.
actually, so I'm a little hesitant to not have a replacement, right? So with the work groups that we established at the last meeting and had committee members commit to, I don't want to necessarily have a replacement for something that sounds as important as that.
I can speak to this a bit. So there are 3 formal subcommittees that were established pre-pandemic. One is the housing subcommittee that David just referenced. One is a services and resource subcommittee, and one is a community mobility subcommittee. None of those have been meeting during the pandemic. So I think the discussion for you all is whether you want to sort of reinvigorate those and carry on, or if you want to formally dissolve those, look at the immediacy of these work groups, and then kind of step back and look at what standing subcommittees make sense going forward. The difference between subcommittees and work groups is that subcommittees are subject to open meeting laws. They're formed and dissolved by vote, as opposed to a work group, which is just a less formal structure.
And usually time limited work groups are usually within the calendar year of appointments, just typically. And that's to really respect the work group subcommittee dividing line. So there are going to be, so for definitely we want to have our finance materials be public, things like that. So I'd like to hear more about the housing subcommittee. Emily or David, do you know if that was picked up anywhere in the system during COVID? If those subcommittees stopped meeting during COVID, did it reconfigure in another way?
It did not. We haven't had a meeting since 2020. And I don't have them right here, but maybe this is some action to take at the next meeting. We were meeting regularly and just kind of keeping track of all the projects in the pipeline that could support people with experiencing homelessness. Sharing information with them. I guess what I recall is that we were told that because of the limited capacity of the city staff and the virtual meeting, the subcommittees could not meet during COVID. So we have a reconstituted meeting.
Okay. Go ahead, Jen.
So would this vote impact, do we need to make any then revisions to the bylaws? I think is where my question is trying to get to. So, or does this follow in alignment with removing this and then creating these work groups in alignment with the bylaws? Does that make sense?
It does. The intent was to formally dissolve to establish work groups, but even from this discussion, I would guarantee you that this is the first I've heard of this other subcommittee. Did any other members, have you heard about this or worked with this during your time in HIAC? It just sounds like a pretty important working group, but you mentioned David Nash, the assignment of committee members. So that's what makes me think it was more of a work group than a formal subcommittee, because subcommittees are only made up of committee members, typically, unless they're by special appointment. So if we are to continue our discussion on dissolving the subcommittees, I would put forward to the committee a vote of dissolving all the subcommittees except the housing subcommittee, so I can get more information for you and we can have a replacement if that sounds acceptable. So the actual votes will be to dissolve all subcommittees except for the housing subcommittee until May, until we can get more information and take action on that, because I'd either love to personally have it reconstituted in that way. It sounds pretty pivotal, especially now, right? So we've just touched on 3 different home and housing homelessness prevention projects, and those are just getting started. What else is in the pipeline that we're not aware of necessarily, because everyone's been limited to meet during COVID? Yes, Councilwoman Roney, go ahead.
So just for my understanding, what I'm hearing is a motion to dissolve subcommittees except for the housing subcommittees while gaining more information on the scope and work of the housing subcommittee.
Yes,
Thank you.
thanks for the clarification. Any other questions before we move on?
And then if the vote is to dissolve, we don't have to have a vote then to create work groups, or we would then do a next step. Okay, so we don't have to have a vote for it.
No, and that's one of the things is by having a work group, it's not an official appointment of an appointed board, but also then you can bring in other outside expertise into the group, so you have some more flexibility. I am hearing that there's an opportunity for those work groups to report back to this one, which is how you would formalize that work and make it part of the public record.
Can I offer a consideration? You might consider including dissolving the housing subcommittee in line with the others and reconstituting that as a work group so that it could be more immediately actionable and could include, additional folks from the community. I don't think the scope of activity needs to look different in that work group. Just the sort of formality of the structure would change.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Emily, for reminding us of the immediacy, right? So our effort right now this year is not to get bogged down in bureaucracy and to be active. Could I have a committee member make a motion to dissolve all the subcommittees in favor of establishing work groups?
I'll make that motion. This is David.
Can I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Jason. So we will formally dissolve the subcommittees and establish work groups. I do want to make special mention of the housing working group that is yet to be established. David, I will follow up with you on that. Yes, Kim.
So as a point of order, I'm not currently clear if you have a quorum and you would need to have a roll call vote for that.
We do have a quorum and we will have a roll
Thank you.
call for that. Okay, so now that it's been seconded, I'm going to go through the roll call. Thank you, David. I have you added to my roll call now. David Bartholomew did vote yes. Jason?
Yes.
Debbie Alford for Amy Hobson.
Yes.
Tim McElroy.
Yes.
David Nash.
Yes.
Tim Fertiz.
Yes.
Thank you. The motion unanimously passes to dissolve the subcommittees and establish working groups as mentioned. Now I'm going to turn it over to Emily for really the meat of our program today. We're digging into the system performance measures. We first started discussing those last month, and thankfully Emily has come up with an absolutely great presentation for us to more deeply understand. So this informs our work, particularly as we look to our nominations committee work group and finance work group.
Great, thank you. Christina, can you pull those slides up for us? Thank you. You want to go ahead to the next slide? So as you know, we have talked about system performance measures several times in this group, but wanted to really give you sort of a thorough picture of what those metrics are and where the data come from and what the significance of them are so that we can have this good information baseline to inform work going forward. So today we're going to look at background, purpose and use, both federally and locally, the process, the limitations, goals, what the framework actually is, and then we'll look at our results that were recently submitted, I believe in February for FY21, and then talk about next steps. Next slide. So some basic background on the system performance measures. All of this is language directly from HUD. So system performance measures are a tool that are used to do this. So provide a focus on viewing the local homeless response as a coordinated system of homeless assistance options, as opposed to homeless assistance programs and funding sources that operate independently in a community. To facilitate this perspective, the Act now requires communities to measure their performance as a coordinated system, in addition to analyzing performance by specific projects or project types. So the idea is that, you know, again, as I said earlier about unsheltered homelessness, none of this happens in a vacuum. The idea is that we need a strong service system as a whole, and so want to be measuring the performance of that service system as a whole across the community. All of these interventions really work together in order to work most effectively. It's not possible to have, you know, a high performing shelter only because we need to have housing options for people to exit shelter into. It's not possible to have high performing street outreach only because street outreach is intended to connect people with other resources in the community that also need to be high performing. So the goal is to look at the system as a whole. Next slide. Again, the intent of these selection criteria are to encourage continuum of care in coordination with ESG program recipients and other stakeholders to regularly measure their progress in meeting the needs of people experiencing homelessness and to report this progress to HUD. And this is a competitive element in the annual continuum of care program competition. So we are directly rewarded based on how well our community is performing in the work of ending homelessness as measured by these system performance metrics. Next slide. So our role, and that means me as staff, it means you all as governance, it means service providers and all of our stakeholders. Our role is to understand, evaluate, and improve the system as a whole in its ability to end homelessness. So the goal here is to use these system performance measures locally to improve our crisis response system. So what are the data telling us about where our opportunities are to do a better job ending homelessness? Improving that performance as measured in these has a direct result of increased funding for our community, and most importantly, improving system performance results in fewer people experiencing homelessness. Next slide. So the process with these, this is again required annual reporting to the federal government, specifically using HMIS data. So that's certainly one of the limitations. The data that we're looking at is only data coming directly out of HMIS. The report is typically due early in the calendar year for the reporting period of the prior federal fiscal year, so October 1st to September 30th. Some local limitations that we have are that not all service providers participate in HMIS, although, you know, as you know, we have been really improving that, having a lot more participation in our community in HMIS, which is really wonderful. At the moment, our largest service provider that does not participate in HMIS is the Rescue Mission, but Michael Woods and I have been working on some options around that. It's possible that we may be able to get sort of a system patch where we can export data from his system to import into HMIS. So we're looking at that right now, but certainly he's really open to that conversation. That's been, that's an exciting thing for us to be looking at. And that would be a really big addition to our data as a community. The data pulled from HMIS for the system performance measures is specifically based on entries into the system and exits from the system. And so what that means is if someone comes into a shelter, then they show up as an entry into that shelter. And then when they leave the shelter, they are exited from the system. There are some project types in our community that are not using that same method of HMIS data collection. So that's outreach, for example, day services like AHOPE. So some of our really key data, particularly around unsheltered homelessness, is not represented here. We're working on that, hoping to be able to change that this year. And then it's really important to remember that system performance measures will always lag behind improvements in HMIS because we're always looking at the prior federal fiscal year. So there's a look back period. It will take a bit to catch up as our system improves. Again, our goals are to understand what system performance measures are, why they matter, what our current data are, and the limitations that we've just talked about. My hope for today is that we really establish some baseline understanding of what our data tell us in the community, but also what these system performance measures are intended to represent so that we can use this to inform kind of our thinking and our action steps as we go forward to really continually evaluate as we're looking at prospective projects or changes to our service system. How will this impact our system performance? Because the better our system performs, the more we're able to end homelessness in our community. Next slide. So this is a very quick overview of what the 6 system performance measures are. There are actually 7. One is about prevention, and communities have not been reporting on that the last several years. So these are the key 6 system performance measures. So how many people are homeless for the first time? How many people have exited homelessness but returned to homelessness? How long are people staying homeless? Are people increasing their employment and their non-employment income? What's the ability of our system to help people obtain and maintain housing? And then how many people are experiencing homelessness in our community? So ultimately, what is the ability of our system to eliminate homelessness by decreasing the number of people who are homeless? Next slide. So, and next slide. So we are going to deep dive into each of these measures and what our most recent submitted data were. So measure 1, length of time that people remain homeless. This is looking at how long people are homeless. Again, keep in mind, this is all about HMIS data in our community. So this is looking at how long people are homeless within our continuum of care based on the number of bed nights in emergency shelters or in transitional housing programs. And the system is pulling data from back to 2012 to look at length of time homeless. So again, keep in mind that as we improve our utilization of HMIS, there's going to be a delay in that catching up to our system performance measures. So in the data set that we just submitted for FY21, so October 1st of 2020 through September 30th of 2021, that data set included 861 people. And for emergency shelter only, the length of time homeless was 120 days. When we add in transitional housing programs, the length of time homeless was 224 days. So pretty significant, a federal goal for, or a benchmark at the federal level for communities that are working towards functional zero, which means you have people really flowing through your system. People are not just stuck in your system and continuing to be homeless. That benchmark is that folks are homeless for 90 days or less. And so we certainly have some opportunity here when we're looking at 120 days or 224 days. Next slide. Measure 2, and also let me say, you all please feel free to jump in at any point if you have questions about any of these as we go along. Measure 2 is about returns to homelessness from housing. So after people exit the system, exit homelessness into permanent housing, are they staying housed or do they return to homelessness again? So this is looking at folks who exited to housing in the 2 years prior to the report period, as well as the report period. Our reported data for this past year is that we had 7 folks who were unsheltered who exited into permanent housing. And again, we're not tracking as much data on unsheltered homelessness as we have the opportunity to do. So we'll hope to improve that this year. So we certainly have had more than 7 people who have exited unsheltered homelessness into permanent housing. One of those folks became homeless again. Emergency shelter, 101 exits, 30 of those became homeless again. Transitional housing, 213 exits, 22 became homeless again. And permanent housing, 123 exits, 14 became homeless again. An exit from permanent housing can mean that you're graduating someone from a program. So presumably they're continuing to be housed in that unit, but are no longer in HMIS as a program participant. Or could certainly mean that they were exited from the program for noncompliance. But overall, 14 returns to homelessness within a 2-year period. And this is also measuring returns to homelessness, meaning this person had a new HMIS entry as homeless in a program across our service system.
Well, this is pretty fascinating data for transitional housing. I think that's we don't discuss that a lot in our community, but look at that. So it's what, like you had only a 10% return from the number of exits. That's okay. That's really educational. Thanks. I don't want to belabor it.
I
Next
wonder,
slide.
Sarah, that's a good point. I wonder, Emily, if there would be an opportunity to add like a percentage over on this slide as well to really show the impact.
Sure. Next slide. Measure 3 is looking at the number of people who are homeless in the service system. There are 2 parts to measure 3. So 3.1 is looking at the change in the number of people experiencing homelessness based on the point in time count, not based on HMIS data. So you can see our 2020 and 2021 data here, and we've been through those before. We'll have 2022 data soon. And then next slide. 3.2 is measuring the change in the number of sheltered people who are homeless based on HMIS data. So again, keep in mind limitations of HMIS participation. But this metric does deduplicate to account for people who stayed in multiple programs. So if someone was in emergency shelter and transitional housing during that time period, that data is deduplicated to show the total number of people who are interacting with the system. Next slide. Measure 4 is looking at employment and income growth and measuring the change in either earned or non-employment income. So non-employment income meaning disability income primarily. But this metric is specific to people who are in continuum of care funded programs. So in our community, the continuum of care funding is supporting permanent supportive housing at Homeward Bound and rapid rehousing at Helpmate. Helpmate does not participate in HMIS because victim service provider organizations are precluded from participating in HMIS for confidentiality and safety purposes. So the data available for this measure are specifically from permanent supportive housing at Homeward Bound. So you can see in 2020, they had 125 participants in those projects. They have more than 125 people in permanent supportive housing, but this is, again, specific to continuum of care funded permanent supportive housing. 58 of those folks were able to increase income. And then in 2021, they had 112 participants. 54 of those folks were able to increase income.
This is a question for David Bartholomew. David, was the SOAR program active in 2021? Does the SOAR program still interface with Homeward Bound? Can you give me a little update on that?
Yeah, in Buncombe County, we still do have the SOAR program. We did lose an attorney in early 2021 who was handling the disability, and so there was a little bit of a lull while we replaced staff, but there is a new attorney who's handling all of the SOAR referrals in Buncombe.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Next slide. Thank you. Measure 5 is looking at people who are homeless for the first time. So that is looking at folks who enter the system who do not have any prior enrollments in HMIS in the past 2 years. Again, remember the limitations of our available data. So if we had a shelter program that had not been participating in HMIS in the past is now participating. We had a person who was in that shelter program in the past and has now enrolled in a different program. They would appear to be homeless for the first time, but that may not necessarily be true if their data weren't tracked previously. In 2021, we showed 819 people who were entering emergency shelter, transitional housing, or permanent housing. And of those, 684 people did not have HMIS entries in the past 24 months. Does that make sense? So I would expect that a significant number of those 684 people were homeless for the first time, but would also be true that a number of those folks may have been in other programs in the past and just didn't have that data recorded.
Emily, I do have a follow-up question to that, and I'm sorry if you've already said this. So HMIS is a system-wide, bigger than just Buncombe County. So if an individual was in a shelter, let's say like in the Wake area, would they be considered within the last 24 months if they had been in another shelter, or is it only based on whether or not they're entered in our 501 continuum of care area considered in that 24 months?
It's only looking at data in our continuum of care.
Okay.
So if they there are ways to do data sharing across continuum of care. And if they had been in a program in Wake, they would already have a profile created in the system, but this is really specifically evaluating their entries into programs within our continuum of care.
And so I do wonder what opportunities would exist for us to do that? Because I also wonder if we are looking at new unsheltered and unhoused, or are we looking at people who are transient and have moved from one area to another that are in the system and accessing services in another community? And is that something that we would ever be able to really look more closely at?
Yes, I would say that's not something that this particular measure looks at, but that is something that we would be able to look at. One of the entry questions in HMIS is about the zip code of your last permanent address and also where you stayed the night before you entered this program. So there are ways to look at that data. All right, next slide. Measure 7 is looking at exits to permanent housing. So the number of folks who are exiting homelessness into permanent housing and the number of people who are already in permanent housing projects who retained that housing, so did not become homeless again. This is just the data from this past federal fiscal year. So the number of folks who exited from unsheltered homelessness, 30 people, 16 of those were positive exits, so a 53% success rate. Emergency shelter, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing. And again, in a rapid rehousing program, the exit information would presumably mean that person is continuing to be in that unit. They're just no longer in that particular program. 636 exits, 41% of those were positive exits. And then in permanent supportive housing, which includes retention, and 99% success rate. So 387 people, 382 of whom are still in housing. So it's really strong. That means we have really strong permanent supportive housing projects operating in our community. Certainly we have additional need for more permanent supportive housing, but really great to see that our permanent supportive housing is working so well. Any questions about this one? Okay. Next slide. So we have been working with our Office of Data and Performance, and those folks were with you all recently to show the dashboard of the point in time data that's now up on the city's website. That'll be updated with the 2022 data. And we're also looking to build out from that and include the system performance measure data on the city's website on an ongoing basis. The hope is that we can get to a point where we have such strong data and such strong HMIS participation that our system performance data can be a really accurate reflection of what's happening in our community, and B, we'll be able to pull these metrics more frequently than once a year. We can run this report at any point in time. So ideally, we'll get to a place where we're able to really be evaluating the performance of our system on a more regular basis, twice a year, quarterly, something like that, to look at how effective we are at ending homelessness. And the big opportunity with these data are to identify weaknesses in our system. You know, where are the places that we need to really shore up our system's performance so that it is functioning more robustly, able to end homelessness for a greater number of people, and to really keep that flow happening through our system. My hope is that we will all, you know, certainly in our office, for you all and for our service providers, that system performance measures can be really an intrinsic part of our culture in our community, that as we are looking at strategies and funding decisions, policy recommendations, you know, for you all, that's certainly part of your role. As we're looking at decision making and recommendations, that we're really grounded in these system performance measures and understand, you know, to me, these are things that we have to report onto HUD. This is a federal requirement, but the reason that HUD has identified these particular metrics is because they are reflective of how well we are ending homelessness. So it is not just sort of a bureaucratic process, but is really kind of the meat of the work of ending homelessness. So my hope is that we really get kind of anchored in these system performance measures and can use that to drive our decision making and our work as we go forward, so that our system can be continually improving. Tim.
Yeah, is this data available? The SPMs, can we drill down to that by participant, HMIS participant?
I don't think so. I don't know. I'll have to look. Definitely I think those are reports that you all as an HMIS participating agency could run for your program. So probably you would be able to find that client level data, you know, for confidentiality purposes. That data is not publicly available, but hopefully you saw in the meeting materials, I did include the full report that we submitted to HUD for system performance measures. And we, again, are working with our Office of Data and Performance to get this data on our website and updated on a regular basis. So to look at client level data, I think that's something that you and I could work on to pull HMIS reports for your programs. It's not something that we would have publicly available for the system as a whole.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Great, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for analyzing and digesting and putting that together for us, Emily. I think that's really helpful for me. I'm sure within each of our systems, we can each see sort of weaknesses or where we can maybe apply some pressures on the lever in certain areas. So we'll be thinking about that. And again, if you have any issues with accessing the meeting materials, please contact me or Emily. Does anybody have any initial takeaways from the data that Emily presented today they want to share? Yeah, it was a lot of data. So I encourage us to really become familiar. That's going to drive a lot of our work. So we started last month. We've had a deep dive now, and we'll be tackling it in different ways in our meetings. We'll be looking at the different measures. We'll look at a different measure for each meeting, and also encouraging you to look within your system. So I do want to revisit our systems request for data. To back that up last month, we are going to be working on that going forward. We do need to work with the CEOs and the leaders of those organizations, also with our committee members. And we've started that process. So I really look forward to how we can use our different lenses to start tackling some of these problems. I mean, there was like a 77% jump in one of the unsheltered homeless numbers from 2020 to 2021 is what jumps out at me. So, that's not just having access to a state ID that's causing people to not stay in a shelter. That's just a large volume of growth. And as we heard from Trinity Place, our service providers are experiencing pressures that many businesses of operation are experiencing with staff shortages, not necessarily funding. That is not unique to Trinity Place, unfortunately. Many of our homeless service providers in the system are also experiencing that. So I think just looking at the volume of numbers, it's really easy to see the pressure that's been on the system. Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, I think that was extremely valuable information. The VA measures a little bit different in looking at the same metrics that we were talking about today. But and Sarah, I noted the same thing that you did with the transitional housing piece and the number of for folks returning to homelessness. I mean, those percentages were the lowest on the board at 10.3%. So, that's not a piece I think that's talked about, frequently enough, because that, really that transitional housing piece, better prepares folks to, move into permanent housing and retain that housing. So, very, very interesting numbers. And again, thanks to Emily for putting all that together.
Great. Any other reflections? Did I miss anyone's hand? I hope not. All right. Christina, I'm going to turn it over to public comment at this time. Christina and her team were working late last night to make sure that our lines were open. I really appreciate all the effort.
Yeah, thank you. So there's speakers in the queue, but they're just listening. They don't have their hands raised to make a comment. So we don't have any comments at this moment.
Okay, we haven't received any by email. So we're going to publicly adjourn if I don't have any other reflections or questions. Yes, David.
Bear with me on the noise. I just wanted to remind or inform you, I guess, that I've been reappointed to the State Interagency Council on Coordinating Homeless Programs, and that group, which hasn't met much in the last 2 years, is going to meet it for the first time next week. So I'll try to give a report back. I think the initial meetings will probably just be around getting organized and figuring out what we're supposed to do again. But I think, and if there's any information that anybody would like for me to convey in the other direction, just let me know.
Wow, that's a wonderful appointment. Thank you so much for doing that, David, and for letting us know. Any other updates anyone wants to share? All right, thank you so much for your time. Again, 2 months in a row with quorum. I really appreciate everyone's diligence as we work through our restructuring. And for those folks that have committed to being on the work groups, I really appreciate your extra level of involvement. Our next meeting will be May 27th, 2022. It will also be virtual until further notice. And have a great weekend. Thank you so much for attending the Homeless Initiative Advisory Committee today.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie, for filling in for Amy.